In the earlier centuries of the Imperium's ascent, when the stars still seemed vast and unconquered, there existed a sense of inevitable destiny that wrapped itself around humanity like a mantle of gold. It was the age now remembered as the Great Crusade. Across the void, fleets bearing the sigil of the Imperium burned bright against the darkness. They were vast armadas of silver and iron, their prows shaped like the heads of eagles, their hulls etched with a lightning bolt and the thunderbolt of unity. They did not drift aimlessly. They advanced with purpose. Each translation into real space marked another step in a design so immense that few among those who served could fully comprehend it. At the center of this grand endeavor stood the Emperor of mankind. He was not merely a ruler. He was the architect of a future that rejected superstition, rejected fragmentation, rejected the long night that had swallowed humanity during the age of strife. His vision was not spoken loudly, nor explained in simple terms. It existed in proclamations, in decrees, in the silent certainty that radiated from him. Those who beheld him did not doubt. From Terra, the cradle of mankind, he directed the reconquest of the galaxy. Terra itself had been remade. Where once it had been scarred by radiation storms and fractured by techno-barbarian warlords, now it stood unified beneath the banners of the Imperium. Its skies were controlled, its hives disciplined, its armies ordered, and at its heart, within halls of impossible scale, the Emperor governed in solemn silence. The Great Crusade was not chaos. It was order in motion. Legions of space marines, gene-forged warriors, towering and tireless, carried the Emperor's will into distant systems. They were the first wave of compliance, descending upon fractured human worlds and offering unity under a single truth. Some planets welcomed the Imperium with reverence, seeing in it salvation from isolation. Others resisted, clinging to autonomy, to divergent creeds, to ways of life shaped by centuries of solitude. Resistance rarely endured, for alongside the legions came iterators, diplomats, remembrancers, and technocrats. The Imperium did not seek annihilation where assimilation would suffice. It sought integration, standardization, compliance. Across thousands of stars, banners were raised and oaths were sworn. In these years, confidence was not arrogance, it was atmosphere. Humanity believed itself ascending. Warp routes were charted. Forged worlds rekindled ancient manufactories. Shipyard produced cruisers by the dozen. The Mechanicum of Mars stood in alliance with Terra, bound by treaty and mutual ambition. Together they resurrected technologies once thought lost to myth. The Emperor's sons, the Primarchs, had begun to take their places at the head of this expansion. Each was a being of extraordinary presence, crafted not merely as generals but as exemplars. They inspired devotion among their warriors and fear among their enemies. When a Primarch strode onto a battlefield, the course of campaign shifted as if guided by gravitational force. And yet, despite such magnificence, there remained a singular truth understood by all who truly served. All glory flowed from the Emperor. His was the vision that united Terra. His was the mind that conceived the Legiones Astartes. His was the ambition that refused to allow humanity to fracture ever again. In the vast audience chambers of the Imperial Palace, emissaries from newly compliant worlds would kneel upon marble floors veined with gold. They would raise their eyes, briefly, to behold a figure seated upon a throne carved from materials not found on any single world. They often struggled to describe what they saw. Some perceived radiance. Others perceived overwhelming gravity, as if standing too near a star. A few remembered only the sensation of being known completely, of having every thought and weakness laid bare. The Emperor did not speak often. When he did, his words carried the stillness of finality. It was in this era, before betrayal, before brother turned against brother, that unity seemed unbreakable. Fleets returned to Terra in triumph. Tides flowed inward. New recruits were tested and elevated. The imperial truth, austere and rational, spread across compliant systems. It denied the existence of gods. It denied the legitimacy of superstition. It promised enlightenment through reason, strength through unity, and for a time, that promise felt attainable. Within the inner sanctums of the palace stood the Adeptus Custodes. They were not legionaries. They were not generals of distant fronts. They were guardians, singular creations of artifice and genecraft, each forged with care beyond measure. Their armor gleamed like polished dawn, each plate engraved with sigils of duty and sacrifice. They bore guardian spears that hummed softly with contained energy. They did not leave Terra lightly. Their duty was singular, the protection of the Emperor himself. Where Space Marines were instruments of conquest, the Custodians were instruments of preservation. They stood at gates that few could approach. They lined corridors whose ceilings vanished into shadow. They watched in silence while diplomats pleaded, while Primarchs conversed, while High Lord debated policy and resource allocation. Among them was one whose vigil would become the subject of quiet recollection. He was neither the first of their number nor the most celebrated in open record. The Custo did not seek renown. Their service was defined by anonymity within perfection. Yet his watch coincided with a moment suspended between triumph and something less certain. He stood before the throne during an audience granted to no Primarch, no admiral, no envoy. The chamber was vast beyond mortal scale. Light filtered through stained glass depicting humanity's resurgence, casting colored reflections across the marble floor. Incense drifted in measured curls, its fragrance engineered to calm and focus. The Emperor sat in stillness, not in slumber, nor in meditation as mortals understood it. His awareness was expansive, distant, occupied with matters beyond perception of any present. The Custodian did not shift. Hours passed as seconds might for lesser beings. His armor's internal systems regulated temperature, oxygen, and posture. His breathing remained steady, controlled. Through helm lenses he observed nothing out of place. Through enhanced perception he noted every subtle vibration of the chamber's machinery. To stand so close to the Emperor was to experience proximity to unfathomable intention. Beyond the palace walls, news arrived of victories, systems brought into compliance, alien enclaves extinguished, human civilizations reunited with their lost kin. The Imperium's borders expanded in luminous arcs across star charts. Yet within the throne room there was only stillness. The Custodian reflected, not in doubt, for doubt had been excised from him long ago, but in disciplined contemplation. He understood that conquest was not the Emperor's ultimate goal. Expansion was a means. Unity was a foundation. There existed some greater structure yet unseen, an edifice of design that required time and unwavering control. The Emperor's gaze, though unfocused immortal perception, rested briefly upon the Guardian. No words were spoken. None were required. In that silence lay trust. Trust that Terra would remain inviolate. Trust that while legions warred among the stars, the heart of humanity remained shielded. Trust that the Great Crusade, vast and relentless, would not falter through neglect at its core. Outside, banners fluttered in artificial winds. Within, the Custodian maintained his vigil. It is easy, in later centuries, to view this era through the lens of what followed, to see hints of fracture in every decision, to detect shadow behind every triumph. But in that moment, such thoughts had no place. The Imperium was ascending. Humanity marched forward under a single banner. The Emperor's design, though incomprehensible in its entirety, inspired absolute certainty among those closest to him. And so the Custodian stood, golden and unmoving, before the master of mankind, a solitary sentinel in a chamber of immeasurable scale, guarding not merely a throne, but the fragile dawn of an empire that believed itself eternal. The light through the stained glass shifted slowly as Terra rotated beneath the sun. Footsteps echoed faintly in distant corridors. Far above, void shields shimmered against solar radiation. Within the throne room, there remained only silence and vigilance. And in that silence, the future waited, patient, unseen, and vast beyond reckoning. In the years when the Great Crusade advanced with unbroken momentum, Terra became less a world and more a symbol. From orbit, its continent shimmered beneath layers of defense grids and atmospheric regulators. Vast shipyards encircled it in slow rotation, constructing vessels destined for the furthest edges of mapped space. Within those docks, the labor of millions converged into singular purpose. Plasma furnaces roared without pause. Hull plates were forged and riveted into cathedral-like warships whose shadows eclipsed entire districts below. Every completed vessel carried more than armaments. It carried belief that humanity's scattered branches would be gathered into one indivisible whole. Belief that isolation, superstition, and internecine war were relics of a benighted age now firmly behind them. The Custodian who stood before the Emperor bore silent witness to this belief. Though his station seldom changed, information flowed to him through secure channels embedded within his armor. He required no overt displays to remain informed. Strategic summaries, reports of compliance actions, confirmations of treaty ratifications, all pass across his consciousness in measured intervals. World after world had bent the knee. On some, the arrival of the Imperium ended centuries of despair. Warp storms that had once cut them off from neighbors began to recede, navigators charting reliable paths where none had existed. On others, planetary tyrants were deposed, their armies overwhelmed by the disciplined might of the Legiones Astartes. Resistance was methodical, not chaotic, overwhelming force applied with calculated restraint. This was not conquest for spectacle. It was reclamation. The Emperor's vision demanded uniformity not as suppression, but as stabilization. Fragmented cultures were integrated into the wider Imperium. Local customs were catalogued, assessed, and either preserved in moderated form or quietly discouraged if they conflicted with the imperial truth. Shrines were dismantled where they contradicted rational doctrine. Superstitions were replaced with instruction. Education became as vital as armament. And always, Terra remained the axis. Within the imperial palace, councils convened beneath vaulted ceilings supported by pillars carved from ancient stone. High officials debated supply routes and population tides. Representatives of the Mechanicum spoke in Benheric cant of recovered technologies and new patterns of armament production. Iterators refined the language by which compliance would be explained to newly contacted worlds. Yet the Emperor himself did not attend these assemblies. His absence was not neglect. It was intention. He labored upon works known only to a few. Deep within the palace complex, beyond chambers of ceremony and halls of governance, projects of immense scale progressed under his direction. The nature of these undertakings remained concealed even from many among the highest ranks. Only fragments of understanding existed, whispers of a future secured not merely by fleets and legions, but by pathways yet unopened. The Custodian did not question the secrecy. His kind had been shaped to accept proximity to mystery without seeking to unravel it. Loyalty defined them. Where others might speculate, they maintained focus. Still, proximity to the Emperor granted perspective unavailable elsewhere. When Primarchs returned to Terra between campaigns, the atmosphere shifted subtly. These towering figures, gene-crafted paragons of command, carried with them the aura of distant battlefields. Some approached the throne with visible pride, recounting victories in measured tones. Others stood in respectful silence, awaiting guidance. The Emperor's responses were precise. Encouragement when necessary, correction when warranted, always measured. It was clear to the Custodian that even these magnificent sons were instruments within a design far greater than themselves. Confidence characterized the era. The Imperium star charts grew increasingly dense with compliant systems. Supply lines extended in stable corridors. The Astronomican burned as a psychic beacon, guiding navigators through the shifting tides of the warp. Its light symbolized order imposed upon chaos. In distant sectors, Xeno's empires were encountered and, when deemed irreconcilable, removed. Records of these campaigns were archived with clinical efficiency. The Imperium did not wage war for hatred. It waged war for survival and continuity. Yet amid triumph, the Custodian perceived something subtle. Not flaw, not weakness, but strain. Unity on such scale required constant reinforcement. Each new world added to the Imperium brought its own history, its own grievances, its own expectations. Administrators worked tirelessly to standardize governance. Astropaths strained to maintain communication across swelling distances. The very immensity of success introduced complexity. Standing before the throne, the Custodian considered this not with apprehension, but with clarity. An empire of 1,000 worlds demanded vigilance beyond that of a single battlefield. The Emperor, seated in composed stillness, bore that burden without visible sign. Yet to those attuned to nuance, there were moments when his gaze turned inward, distant beyond even the farthest star. During one such interval, a delegation arrived from a recently compliant system, a cluster of industrial worlds rich in mineral wealth. Their leaders knelt in the vast chamber, voices echoing softly as they pledged resources and loyalty. The Custodian observed their posture, their cadence, the tremor beneath practiced calm. They believed in the Imperium's strength. They believed in its permanence. But beneath that belief lay or tinged with fear. For Terra was overwhelming. Its scale dwarfed imagination. Its regiments marched in endless formation. Its towers pierced cloud layers engineered to precise density, and within its heart sat a being whose mere presence reshaped perception. When the delegation departed, silence returned. The Custodian reflected upon the paradox of unity. Humanity had once been fractured by distance and ignorance. Now it was bound together by will and vision. Yet bonds required maintenance. Discipline required renewal. The Great Crusade could not simply conquer. It must also sustain. Reports arrived of worlds requiring secondary compliance actions, not rebellion, but misinterpretation of doctrine. The imperial truth demanded careful dissemination. Without clarity, misunderstanding could fester. The Custodian understood that vigilance extended beyond physical threat. It encompassed ideology. Still, within the palace there was calm assurance. The Emperor's project advanced. The legions remained loyal. The Primarchs, though diverse in temperament, were united in purpose. The Imperium's expansion seemed inexorable. As Terra rotated into its artificial night, light dimmed within the throne chamber to a subdued radiance. Servitors moved with mechanical precision along the periphery, maintaining environmental systems and archival interfaces. Their presence was unobtrusive, almost spectral. The Custodian did not require rest as mortals did. His mind entered states of controlled equilibrium, maintaining awareness while conserving strength. In these intervals, memory aligned with present duty. He remembered the final unification wars of Terra, when thunder and dust had filled the skies. He remembered standing amid the ruins of techno-barbarian citadels as banners bearing the thunderbolt were raised. Compared to that era, the present felt serene. Yet serenity did not negate responsibility. For at the center of all triumph stood a single figure, and that figure bore the weight of humanity's future. The Custodian tightened his grip upon his guardian spear, not from tension, but from reaffirmation. Outside the palace, billions slept beneath the watchful glow of orbital defenses. Across the galaxy, fleets translated through the warp, their courses guided by the Astronomican's steady blaze. Within the throne room, the Emperor remained silent, and before him, the Custodian stood, a solitary sentinel amid the vast machinery of empire, aware that unity was not merely achieved once, but upheld without ceasing. In the quiet between distant triumphs, he understood that the true test of the Great Crusade was not conquest alone, but endurance. As the Great Crusade pressed ever outward, the distances between stars seemed to shrink beneath the will of humanity. What had once required generations of isolated struggle could now be accomplished within a single campaign season. Expeditionary fleets translated from the warp with increasing precision, guided by the steady radiance of the Astronomican. The beacon burned from Terra like a second sun in the immaterial realm, unwavering, constant, a declaration that mankind would no longer drift blindly through cosmic night. Within the imperial palace, however, the passage of time unfolded differently. The Custodian remained at his post before the throne, aware that while fleets advance across unimaginable distances, all lines of purpose ultimately converged here. Terra was not merely administrative center or ancestral home. It was fulcrum. Every compliance action, every oath sworn upon distant soil, drew legitimacy from the silent figure seated within this chamber. News reached Terra of extraordinary victories. Entire subsectors had been brought into alignment without prolonged war. Human civilizations long severed by warp storms were reunited with kin they had believed extinct. Great archives were recovered, repositories of technological insight preserved through millennia of isolation. Forged worlds swore binding accords, pledging their manufactoria to the Imperium's cause. Confidence deepened. The Legiones Astartes became figures of legend upon newly compliant worlds. Their arrival was often described in awed tones, armored giants descending in disciplined silence, their presence both reassurance and warning. The Primarchs, luminous and commanding, served as living embodiments of the Emperor's design. When they spoke of unity, their words carried conviction born of conquest. Yet the Custodian understood that beyond spectacle lay structure. Compliance required integration. Planetary governors were appointed or confirmed. Tithes were assessed with careful calculation. Infrastructure was standardized to facilitate communication and defense. Administratum adepts compiled records with relentless thoroughness. The Imperium expanded not only through force of arms, but through systems deliberate, precise, enduring. Within the throne room, Light filtered through towering windows, shifting in hue as Terra's artificial climate adjusted to the cycle of day. The Emperor's presence remained constant, though his attention seemed at times to extend far beyond visible horizons. On certain occasions, he would rise. When he did, the chamber itself felt altered, as though gravity subtly recalibrated. The Custodian would lower his gaze in reverent acknowledgement, yet his awareness sharpened further. Each movement of the Emperor was deliberate, each gesture infused with intent. During one such interval, a projection of distant battlefields shimmered briefly in the air, a display for his perception alone. Campaign markers flickered across star maps. The Custodian could not interpret the full meaning, but he sensed complexity increasing. Expansion was no longer a simple outward push. It had become a network of overlapping commitments, supply routes interwoven across sectors. Growth carried consequence. Beyond the palace walls, Terra thrived beneath disciplined order. Vast populations labored within hive cities whose foundations rested upon strata of ancient history. Educational institutions propagated the imperial truth with measured rigor. The notion of gods and spirits was dismissed as relic of ignorance. Rationality, unity, and human primacy defined doctrine. And yet, in the void beyond compliant borders, uncertainties persisted. Explorative vessels reported regions where warp currents shifted unpredictably. Some systems lay shrouded behind turbulence that defied established navigation charts. Others revealed traces of civilizations long extinguished, ruins bearing evidence of catastrophic collapse. Such findings were catalogued without panic. The Imperium had risen from its own age of ruin. It would not falter before remnants of lesser powers. Still, the Custodian perceived subtle alterations in the rhythm of reports. Victories continued, but alongside them came accounts of prolonged campaigns. Worlds whose integration required extended effort. Human factions whose loyalty was hesitant rather than immediate. These were not rebellions. They were hesitations. And hesitation, in a structure built upon absolute cohesion, demanded attention. The Emperor remained outwardly serene. When Primarchs sought audience, their demeanors reflected success, ambition, and unwavering dedication. Yet among their varied expressions, pride, determination, restrained fervor, the Custodian sensed divergence. Each son interpreted the Great Crusade through the lens of his own nature. Some valued swift compliance through overwhelming force. Others preferred patient diplomacy. A few displayed intensity bordering upon zeal. Such differences were natural. Unity did not require uniform temperament. It required shared allegiance. In the silence of the throne room, the Custodian contemplated the magnitude of the Emperor's undertaking. To unite 1,000,000 worlds was not merely logistical ambition. It was transformation of species-wide identity. Humanity, once fractured into isolated cultures, was being shaped into singular civilization. The process demanded trust on unimaginable scale. Trust in the Emperor's foresight. Trust in the loyalty of his generals. Trust that reason would prevail over superstition across countless disparate societies. As Terra entered another cycle of artificial night, a faint tremor passed through the palace, the distant resonance of a newly activated defense array in orbit. It was routine, a calibration test. Yet even routine operations reminded the Custodian of the fragility inherent in any structure, no matter how vast. He considered the paradox of expansion. The Imperium grew stronger with each compliant world, yet its borders stretched thinner. Communication lines lengthened. The time required for messages to traverse the warp increased. Autonomy granted to distant commanders necessarily expanded. Authority radiated outward from Terra, but distance introduced interpretation. Interpretation introduced variance. The Custodian did not equate variance with disloyalty, but he recognized it as variable within an equation that demanded balance. The Emperor's gaze shifted once more, distant yet intent. For a fleeting moment, the Custodian sensed something profound. Not concern, not doubt, but calculation of possibilities extending far beyond immediate circumstance. The Great Crusade was triumph, but triumph was not completion. Somewhere beyond the rim of mapped stars, unseen forces observed humanity's ascent. Whether alien polities calculating defense or phenomena within the warp reacting to increasing psychic luminosity, the galaxy was not empty of consequence. Still, within this chamber, serenity prevailed. Servitors continued their silent ministrations. Air circulated with engineered purity. The marble floor reflected muted gold from the Custodian's armor. The Guardian's spear remained steady in his grasp, a symbol not merely of defense but of constancy. He understood that his role was singular yet integral. To stand before the Emperor was to anchor the heart of empire. While fleets ventured into uncertainty, Terra remained inviolate. In distant sectors, banners were planted upon new soil. Oaths echoed beneath unfamiliar skies. The Imperium's name carried weight across systems once divided by fear. And here, at the center of it all, silence endured. The Custodian did not know what challenges lay beyond current horizons. He did not speculate upon futures unannounced. His duty existed in present continuity, in the assurance that whatever storms might one day gather, they would find Terra guarded. As another cycle drew toward its quiet conclusion, the throne room settled into profound stillness. Light dimmed to a gentle radiance. Beyond the palace, Terra turned beneath the stars it had reclaimed. The Great Crusade continued its relentless advance, and before the master of mankind, one golden sentinel remained unwavering, listening to the faint echoes of an expanding empire, aware that even in victory, vigilance must never yield. Distance, during the height of the Great Crusade, was no longer measured solely in light years. It was measured in loyalty sustained, in doctrine upheld, in silence maintained between question and answer. Across the widening Imperium, the fleets pressed deeper into regions that had not heard a human voice in centuries. Expeditionary armadas carried with them not only the might of the Legiones Astartes, but administrators, engineers, scholars, and emissaries of compliance. Each new system added to the Emperor's domain was catalogued, assessed, and woven into the expanding lattice of authority that radiated outward from Terra. To many among humanity's reunited worlds, the Imperium appeared eternal in its confidence. The Custodian, standing immobile before the throne, understood that eternity was not assumption but endeavor. Report arriving from the Galactic North spoke of vast stellar empires reclaimed without sustained conflict. Ancient defense platforms were reactivated under imperial oversight. Planetary populations swore oaths in ceremonies illuminated by the banners of the Aquila. In the Galactic South, compliance actions required greater exertion. There, isolated human cultures had diverged more sharply, some elevating local rulers to near-mythic status, others clinging to fractured ideologies born of centuries without contact. Yet even these differences were subsumed beneath the Emperor's design. The imperial truth was disseminated with measured precision. Superstition was addressed not with ridicule, but with patient correction. Education cadres accompanied the fleets, instructing planetary populations in the principles of rational governance and human primacy. Over time, resistance softened into alignment. The Emperor rarely spoke of these processes. He did not need to. His silence conveyed expectation. His stillness implied inevitability. Within the throne chamber, the air remained cool and controlled. Massive columns cast long shadows across the polished floor. Light filtered through stained glass depicting humanity's rise from ruin, though the scenes represented ideals rather than literal history. The Custodian's armor reflected these colors in muted hues, gold touched by crimson and sapphire. He had not moved from his station in many hours. Movement was unnecessary. Awareness was constant. Through secured channels, he perceived subtle shifts in strategic emphasis. Certain legions were reassigned to reinforce specific fronts. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to worlds whose compliance required reinforcement of trust rather than demonstration of force. Supply routes were recalibrated to account for warp turbulence reported along established corridors. These were refinements, not signs of instability. Yet refinement itself implied complexity. The Imperium was no longer a singular spear thrust outward. It was a vast organism, each sector connected through layers of administration and command. The greater it grew, the more coordination it demanded. On Terra, preparations continued for undertakings known only in outline to those beyond the highest echelons. Deep beneath the palace, infrastructure expanded. Tunnels reinforced with materials resistant to forces not wholly physical. Energetic systems of unusual configuration were tested and recalibrated. The Custodian did not inquire into their purpose. He understood only that the Emperor's focus often extended downward, into foundations unseen. When Primarchs arrived to confer with their father, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Their presence was immense, each carrying the imprint of distant campaigns. Some spoke of swift victories, of alien enclaves scattered like dust before disciplined assault. Others described protracted sieges against fortified human citadels whose rulers mistrusted distant authority. In their varied accounts, one constant remained: success. The Imperium did not retreat. Yet within these audiences, the Custodian observed nuances. A Primarch's pride in his legion's achievements might border upon fierce independence. Another's meticulous recounting of administrative reforms on compliant worlds might reveal preoccupation with governance rather than conquest. These differences were subtle, perhaps even beneficial in diversity. But diversity required guidance. The Emperor's responses were measured, neither indulgent nor dismissive. His sons departed renewed in purpose, though each carried his own interpretation of the path ahead. Beyond the palace, Terra's populace rarely glimpsed such interactions. To them, the Great Crusade was distant but glorious. Triumphs were announced through controlled channels. Artistic depictions of compliance ceremonies adorned public spaces. The narrative was clear. Humanity advanced under singular, enlightened leadership. And it was true. Yet the Custodian understood that truth required protection not only from external threat, but from erosion. Across the Imperium's farthest reaches, commanders operated at increasing remove from direct oversight. Astropathic communication, though reliable, was not instantaneous. Decisions made on frontier worlds carried consequences that might take months to reach Terra in report form. Trust in delegated authority became necessity rather than preference. The Emperor had crafted his generals for precisely such trust. Still, the Custodian contemplated the vastness of the undertaking. An empire of thousands of worlds could not function through constant direct intervention. It required belief in shared vision. It required that each servant of the Imperium internalize the Emperor's intent, even when distant from his presence. Within the throne room, silence deepened as Terra's night cycle settled fully. External noise diminished to a low hum beneath the palace's shielding. Servitors paused in alcoves, dormant until summoned. The Custodian's mind entered a state of heightened equilibrium. He reviewed strategic patterns not as isolated events, but as currents within a broader tide. Expansion, consolidation, reassignment, reinforcement, all moving toward culmination. Yet what form that culmination would take remained known only to the Emperor. There were moments when the Custodian sensed a quiet intensity emanating from the throne. Not agitation, but concentration of extraordinary depth. It was as though the Emperor's consciousness extended along pathways invisible to ordinary perception, touching upon futures yet unrealized. In those moments, the Guardian's resolve strengthened. For if such vast awareness was required, then vigilance at the center must not falter. Outside Terra's orbit, fleets assembled for new campaigns. Warp-capable vessels aligned in disciplined formations, awaiting clearance to translate. Navigators prepared to guide them through the immaterial currents that bound the galaxy's distant shores. Within the throne chamber, the Emperor remained motionless. The Custodian considered the measure of distance once more. It was not the space between stars that challenged unity. It was the space between intention and interpretation. As long as that space remained bridged by loyalty, the Imperium would endure. He tightened his stance imperceptibly, armor servos responding with silent precision. The Guardian spear remained upright, a symbol of unyielding defense. Beyond the palace walls, Terra turned steadily beneath the constellations it sought to master. Across the galaxy, banners of the Imperium advanced into regions uncharted, carrying with them the promise of order. And in the heart of humanity's dominion, one sentinel stood before the Emperor, measuring not miles nor light years, but the steadfastness required to hold an empire together as it stretched toward the infinite dark. As the Great Crusade advanced into its later triumphs, the Imperium no longer felt like an emerging power. It felt inevitable. Across the mapped galaxy, compliance had become expectation rather than exception. Expeditionary fleets moved with practiced coordination. Astropathic choirs relayed confirmations of victory with rhythmic regularity. Entire sectors were designated secure, their resources integrated into the grand design without prolonged disruption. From Terra, the Emperor's authority extended like a silent tide. Within the throne chamber, the Custodian remained at his appointed place, observing the convergence of countless efforts into singular direction. He did not witness battlefields or compliance ceremonies firsthand, yet he perceived their echoes through strategic data and subtle changes in the rhythm of communication. Success had become steady. Steadiness brought confidence. Confidence, in turn, shaped devotion. On newly compliant worlds, statues of the emperor were erected in plazas where former rulers had once stood. His image appeared upon banners, etched into stone, rendered in metal and glass. Though the imperial truth rejected divinity, the awe inspired by his presence could not always be confined to rational terminology. The custodian understood the distinction. Reverence did not equal worship, yet the boundary between them could be delicate. Iterators worked tirelessly to ensure clarity of doctrine. Public addresses emphasized the emperor as supreme leader and architect of unity, not deity. Educational programs reinforced this message. Still, among distant populations who had known only isolation and hardship, gratitude often took on heightened expression. The emperor did not publicly rebuke such sentiment, nor did he encourage it. He remained focused upon the greater architecture of the Imperium's future. Within the palace, administrative complexity deepened. Entire wings were dedicated to the coordination of tide systems across thousands of worlds. Statistical models projected growth decades in advance. Strategic reserves of material were positioned to reinforce frontier campaigns without delay. The Custodian perceived patterns emerging from this accumulation. The Imperium had reached a scale where maintenance rivaled expansion in significance. Compliance action still occurred, but increasing effort was directed toward consolidation, ensuring that worlds already brought into unity remained aligned not only in law, but in conviction. Conviction required example. The Primarchs served as such examples, their presence on compliant worlds reinforcing loyalty through personal authority. Yet even among these towering figures, subtle divergence in interpretation of the Crusade's meaning became more visible. Some emphasized relentless forward motion, arguing that hesitation invited weakness. Others advocated deliberate stabilization before further advance. Each perspective contained merit. Each reflected the temperament of its bearer. The emperor listened to their counsel in measured silence. The custodian observed these audiences without judgment. He recognized that diversity among commanders could strengthen the Imperium, provided that allegiance to central purpose remained absolute. Still, the greater the distance between Terra and frontier worlds, the more interpretation mattered. Astropathic reports occasionally arrived bearing hints of localized variation in doctrine. On certain planets, enthusiasm for the Emperor's leadership bordered upon spiritual favor. In others, compliance was accepted pragmatically, with loyalty expressed through efficiency rather than emotion. Both forms functioned, yet devotion shaped culture in ways policy alone could not. The custodian contemplated this as Terra's daylight shifted across the chamber's stained glass. Scenes of human triumph glowed briefly before fading into evening shadow. The throne's silhouette remained unchanged, golden and immense. To stand so near the Emperor was to feel the weight of devotion directed toward him from across the galaxy. Though he did not seek adulation, its existence generated a subtle current, a collective focus of thought and expectation. The Astronomican continued to burn, sustained by his will. Its light guided fleets, but it also symbolized presence. Even those who never beheld Terra knew that the beacon's radiance originated from their sovereign. In that radiance, devotion gathered. The custodian understood that such gathering could strengthen unity, or distort it, if left without guidance. Within the palace, scholars debated methods to ensure clarity of doctrine across increasingly distant sectors. Communication protocols were refined. Oversight mechanisms were expanded. The Imperium sought not merely obedience, but coherence. And yet, coherence required constant reinforcement. As the Great Crusade pressed further into uncharted territories, contact with non-human civilizations intensified. Some were swiftly overcome. Others required prolonged engagement. Each encounter reaffirmed the Imperium's central premise, that humanity must stand united to survive within a hostile galaxy. This premise fostered solidarity, but it also deepened identification with the Emperor as singular protector. The custodian reflected upon his own role within this evolving dynamic. He did not serve an abstract institution. He served a living being whose vision shaped history. His vigilance was not symbolic. It was immediate. If harm came to the Emperor, the Imperium's unity would fracture in ways impossible to measure. Such awareness did not breed fear. It reinforced resolve. Beyond Terra's orbit, fleet formations realigned for renewed campaigns. Supply convoys departed in steady procession. Within hive cities, population celebrated announcements of new compliant worlds with orchestrated displays of civic pride. The narrative of inevitability strengthened, yet inevitability, the Custodian understood, must be guarded as carefully as territory, for belief in permanence can dull perception of vulnerability. Within the throne chamber, silence deepened as another cycle approached its end. The Emperor's gaze remained distant, perhaps touching upon futures not yet visible to others. His expression did not change, yet the magnitude of his concentration seemed to intensify with each passing year. The Imperium had grown luminous, but luminosity drew attention. The Custodian did not speculate on what might observe from beyond the sphere of compliance. He concerned himself only with what lay within his charge. He adjusted his stance by a fraction, armor responding in silent precision. The Guardian spear remained upright, tip reflecting faint light from the chamber's high vaults. Across the galaxy, devotion to the Emperor solidified into shared identity. Humanity, once scattered and uncertain, now moved with singular direction, and at the center of that direction stood one figure, and before that figure, one Guardian. The shape of devotion was still forming, molded by triumph and unity. Whether it would remain balanced or grow into something heavier lay beyond present certainty. For now, the Imperium endured in confidence, and in the heart of Terra, beneath the vast arches of the Imperial Palace, the Custodian continued his silent vigil, ensuring that the source of humanity's unity remained inviolate as devotion itself expanded to meet the stars. By the later years of the Great Crusade's first great surge, the Imperium had become more than an empire. It had become a presence. Across tens of thousands of light years, humanity moved beneath a single sigil. Star systems once isolated by ignorance now exchanged resources and information in measured cadence. The great fleets advanced along mapped corridors of the warp, their arrival anticipated rather than feared. Governors corresponded with Terra through disciplined channels, reporting stability and requesting guidance with confidence. From the outermost frontiers, the Imperium appeared unstoppable. Yet at its center, there was only stillness. Within the throne chamber of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor remained seated in silent authority. Before him, as he had through uncounted cycles, stood the Custodian, unwavering, immobile, vigilant beyond fatigue. Time behaved differently in that chamber. Outside, world rotated and campaigns unfolded. Fleets translated in and out of the Imperium, their hulls scarred by war and repaired by tireless manufactoria. Administrators drafted decrees affecting billions. Iterators refined language to ensure ideological consistency across cultures separated by vast distance. Inside, silence reigned. The Custodian had come to understand that this silence was not absence of action. It was concentration. The emperors were radiated outward through countless intermediaries, primarchs, generals, governors, yet the source remained here, contained within a singular presence of immeasurable depth. Reports arriving from frontier sectors describe regions nearing full integration. Only isolated pockets of resistance remained, often non-human enclaves clinging to territory soon to be absorbed. Human worlds encountered now were fewer in number, but more divergent in custom and belief, shaped by long separation during the Age of Strife. Each compliance action required adaptation, not compromise of principle, but careful application. The imperial truth persisted as foundational doctrine. Humanity alone must shape its destiny, guided by reason and strength. Yet reason required communication, and strength required restraint when unnecessary force might fracture what could instead be unified. The Custodian reflected upon this as Terra's daylight shifted across the chamber's towering windows. Colored light from stained glass bathed the marble floor in subdued hues. The throne itself seemed almost carved from radiance, though its brilliance was not merely material. The Emperor's gaze was distant. At times, the Custodian sensed that his attention extended beyond the material plane, that his awareness touched currents within the warp itself. The Astronomican's steady blaze required constant focus. It was beacon and anchor both, sustaining navigation across the Imperium's growing breadth. Such exertion was invisible to most. They saw only triumph. They did not perceive the burden. The Custodian did, not through doubt, but through proximity. He understood that the Imperium's expansion demanded more than fleets and legions. It demanded singular will capable of holding disparate elements in equilibrium. The greater the empire grew, the more delicate the equilibrium became. On Terra, construction deep beneath the palace continued without public acknowledgement. Reinforced vaults extended further than before. Energetic systems of immense capacity were calibrated with increasing frequency. Access protocols tightened. The Emperor prepared for something beyond conquest. The Custodian did not know its full shape, yet he sensed its significance. The Great Crusade, vast as it was, felt at times like prelude, like foundation laid for structure yet unseen. Meanwhile, the Primarchs continued their campaigns. Audiences within the throne chamber became less frequent as the Imperium stabilized, yet when they occurred, they carried weight. Victories were acknowledged, strategic adjustments discussed. Occasionally, subtle tension flickered beneath formal discourse, not open conflict, but intensity born of immense personalities pursuing singular purpose across immeasurable distance. The Emperor's responses remained composed. His authority did not diminish, but the Custodian sensed that the very scale of the crusade amplified every nuance. A word spoken on Terra could ripple across sectors. A strategic shift could redirect entire legions. Responsibility deepened with each passing year. Beyond the palace, Terra flourished in disciplined order. Public ceremonies celebrated compliance milestones. Educational institutions expanded. Recruitment for auxiliary forces increased, ensuring that the Imperium's human armies grew alongside its Astartes. Confidence permeated society. Few imagined that unity could fracture. Few considered that magnitude might conceal strain. The Custodian did not entertain speculation. He recognized only that vigilance must never yield to assumption. An empire convinced of its permanence required guardians who understood impermanence as possibility. As Terra entered another cycle of engineered night, illumination within the throne chamber softened. Servitors moved in silent patterns, maintaining atmospheric equilibrium. The faint hum of distant generators underscored the stillness. The Emperor did not move, yet the Custodian sensed profound motion within his stillness, calculations, foresight, intentions extending far beyond immediate campaigns. The Great Crusade approached a point where expansion slowed not from resistance, but from reach. The Imperium had grown so vast that further advance required consolidation behind it. Supply lines stretched thin in certain sectors. Administrators recommended periods of reinforcement rather than continuous outward push. This was natural evolution. Conquest must give way to endurance. The Custodian tightened his stance slightly, armor responding without sound. His guardian spear remained upright, tip aligned with vaulted ceiling far above. He contemplated the paradox at the heart of empire. The Imperium appeared boundless, yet its strength depended upon singular focus. The Emperor embodied that focus. Should his concentration falter, the Astronomican would dim. Should his authority waver, unity would fragment into interpretation. Thus the stillness at the center was not passive. It was foundation. Outside Terra's orbit, fleet prepared for campaigns designed not merely to conquer, but to secure. On distant worlds, governors swore renewed oaths of loyalty. Across the galaxy, humanity moved forward beneath one banner, confident in its destiny. Within the throne chamber, silence deepened. The Custodian understood that history often remembers the roar of battle and the proclamation of victory. It rarely recalls the stillness required to sustain them. He remained motionless, golden against shadow, guardian of that stillness. The Imperium's presence continued to expand, luminous against the infinite dark. Yet at its heart, beyond noise and triumph, there was only a throne and a sentinel who would not yield. There comes a moment in every great endeavor when expansion slows, not because of defeat, but because of magnitude. By the time the Great Crusade had spanned much of the known galaxy, the Imperium stood at such a threshold. Its banners flew across innumerable worlds. Its fleets had crossed regions once thought unreachable. Its legions had shattered hostile empires and reclaimed humanity's scattered dominions. Victory no longer astonished. It was assumed, and yet, within assumption lies a quiet turning of history. From Terra, the Emperor's authority remained absolute. The Astronomican burned with unwavering brilliance, its psychic light stretching across warped corridors that now formed a lattice of human dominion. Navigation was surer than it had ever been. Communication, though strained by distance, flowed with disciplined regularity. But the Imperium had grown vast beyond early projections. Sector governors now presided over territories so large that direct oversight from Terra became increasingly rare. Fleet commanders interpreted broad directives within localized realities. The Primarchs, dispersed across the stars, commanded campaigns of such scope that their autonomy approached sovereignty in all but name. Trust held the structure together. Trust in the Emperor's vision. Trust in the loyalty of his sons. Trust in the institutions forged to maintain cohesion. Within the throne chamber, the Custodian perceived this evolution not as change, but as deepening complexity. He remained as he had always been, still alert, resolute. Yet the cadence of information reaching him revealed subtle shifts. Compliance actions were fewer, but integration reviews were more frequent. Administratum reports emphasized stability metrics rather than territorial gains. Reinforcement fleets were dispatched not to conquer, but to reassure. The Imperium was consolidating. Outside the palace walls, Terra continued its disciplined rhythm. Public discourse celebrated unity achieved. Art and architecture increasingly depicted the Emperor not merely as ruler, but as guiding light of humanity's destiny. Though the imperial truth rejected divinity, symbolism grew ever more radiant. The Custodian recognized the distinction between reverence and worship. He also recognized how easily the former could drift toward the latter. The Emperor himself gave no outward sign of concern. His focus remained immense and distant. Deep beneath the palace, hidden undertakings advanced toward stages of greater intensity. Energy signatures within restricted vaults increased incrementally. Protective protocols multiplied. The Custodian sensed that time, though vast, was narrowing toward convergence. On rare occasions, multiple Primarchs arrived on Terra within close succession. Their presence within the palace created a palpable shift, not tension, but gravity. Each bore the imprint of his legion's character. Each carried triumphs and burdens shaped by prolonged command. Their conversations with the Emperor were private, yet echoes of their dispositions lingered in the chamber afterward. Some spoke with urgency, advocating renewed outward push to bring remaining regions under swift compliance. Others advised caution, emphasizing the importance of fortifying what had already been achieved. A few expressed concern over emerging anomalies in distant sectors, not rebellion, but uncertainty within warp routes or resistance that proved unusually resilient. The Emperor listened. He did not display impatience. He did not display doubt. But the Custodian sensed in those audiences a subtle intensification of scrutiny, as though every variable within the Imperium's vast structure was being measured against an unseen threshold. Beyond the Imperium's expanding sphere, the galaxy remained immense and indifferent. Xenos domains yet untouched by human fleets observed from afar. Warp storm flickered the edges of mapped space. The unknown persisted, yet within the Imperium's borders, confidence endured. For decades, humanity had advanced without catastrophic reversal. Each challenge encountered had been overcome through unity of purpose. The Legiones Astartes remained loyal. The Mechanicum upheld its treaties. The Administratum refined its systems. The Custodian understood that this period, this quiet edge of completion, was not an ending. It was transition. Conquest had forged the Imperium skeleton. Now endurance must become its flesh. Within the throne chamber, the light shifted toward evening once more. The Emperor's form seemed almost immaterial against the golden architecture surrounding him. His presence filled the chamber, yet did not disturb its stillness. The Custodian contemplated the nature of culmination. An empire can expand only so far before it must turn inward, strengthening foundations. The Imperium approached that moment, not because ambition had waned, but because magnitude demanded consolidation. In distant sectors, certain legions were ordered to remain as garrison forces rather than advance further. Compliance celebrations grew more ceremonial than strategic. Attention shifted toward governance, infrastructure, and cultural integration. These were signs not of stagnation, but of maturation. And yet, maturation carries vulnerability. For in stillness, questions may surface at momentum once suppressed. The Custodian did not entertain speculation of discord. His faith in the Emperor's foresight was absolute, yet he recognized that when expansion slows, perception sharpens. Differences among commanders become more visible. Interpretations of doctrine gain nuance. The Emperor's silence within the chamber felt deeper now, not withdrawn, but focused beyond the visible horizon of the Crusade. The Astronomican continued to blaze, but sustaining it required relentless will. The Custodian adjusted his stance by the smallest degree, armor responding with silent precision. His guardian spear remained upright, reflection of the chamber's fading light shimmering along its edge. Outside Terra's orbit, fleet formation shifted to new patterns, not outward thrust, but network defense. On distant worlds, governors swore renewed oaths not to welcome liberation, but to affirm continuity. The Imperium had reached the edge of its first great completion. It stood luminous, unified, immense. Yet history rarely rests upon completion. It turns. Within the throne chamber, no sound disturbed the stillness. The Emperor remained the axis around which all motion revolved, and before him, the Custodian maintained his vigil, aware that even at the height of unity, the greatest responsibility lies not in conquest achieved, but in vigilance preserved. The galaxy beyond remained vast and silent, and at the heart of humanity's dominion, stillness endured, poised upon the threshold of whatever would come next. By the time the Great Crusade approached its mid-century mark, the Imperium had expanded into an ever-growing lattice of stars, systems, and civilizations, each bound in measured allegiance to a vision that only the Emperor fully comprehended. The magnitude of this expansion was unprecedented, a triumph beyond mortal reckoning, yet it carried an unspoken burden that resonated through the very heart of the galaxy. The Custodian remained before the throne, motionless as he had always been. He did not measure the passage of time as ordinary men did. Days, months, and years were irrelevant within the chamber's endless cycle of light and shadow. Instead, he perceived the subtle pulse of the Imperium itself, the ebb and flow of reports, the shifting resonance of fleet movements, the faint tremors of distant compliance actions. All of it converged here, at the throne, and he understood that none of it would hold without constant vigilance. The Emperor's attention was vast, extending far beyond the material boundaries of Terra. He saw sectors that a Custodian could not name, traced movements across warp-swept corridors, and calculated probabilities that would take mortal minds lifetimes to grasp. The Custodian perceived these patterns not as comprehension but as awareness, a steady presence, a current of inexorable that defined the Imperium's very existence. Fleets translated into systems that had once known only isolation. Human civilizations long separated by centuries or millennia were now reconciled under a single banner. Administrators codified governance. Infrastructure rose from barren worlds. Trade and supply routes stretched across space like woven threads in an ever-growing tapestry. And yet, with each added star, each incorporated world, the Custodian sensed the Imperium's weight growing, not in tonnage or volume, but in responsibility. Expansion created not only triumph, but obligation. Each new world required attention, and each attention exacted cost, time, oversight, and willpower. The Emperor carried this burden with apparent ease, but the Custodian knew that what was effortless in appearance required singular focus beyond human endurance. Occasionally, the Primarchs arrived for counsel. Their presence, commanding and overwhelming, reshaped the chamber's atmosphere. Some brought tales of rapid conquest, others of prolonged campaigns requiring patience and negotiation. Each carried their own interpretation of the Emperor's vision, their own strategies for integrating humanity's disparate elements. The Emperor heard them in measured silence, weighing not only their words but the implications of every command they might issue across the stars. The Custodian observed every nuance, aware that subtle differences in interpretation could ripple across entire sectors, yet also understanding that the Emperor's authority provided cohesion beyond comprehension. The Legiones Astartes were formidable in battle, but it was the alignment of purpose that truly forged the Imperium's unity. On Terra, the Imperium citizens continued their disciplined existence. Hive cities expanded vertically as well as horizontally, their vast layers humming with industrial activity and civic regulation. Education and indoctrination reinforced loyalty to the Emperor's vision, while the imperial truth shaped ideology with absolute consistency. The populace, though largely unaware of the full scope of governance or military strategy, felt the certainty of order. Yet the Custodian knew that certainty was fragile. Systems in distant sectors could falter. Warp currents could delay communications. Unexpected events could ripple into consequence. And while the Emperor's will was absolute, it was not static. It required constant adjustment, foresight, and vigilance. Within the throne chamber, the Custodian contemplated the paradox of permanence and fragility. Humanity had reached a pinnacle it had scarcely imagined a century prior, yet the very scale of achievement introduced variables that demanded attention beyond what even mortal planners could conceive. The greatest victories carried hidden weight. The greatest triumphs required guardianship. Occasionally, light from the chamber's high windows would shift with Terra cycle, casting elongated shadows across the polished marble floor. The Custodian's armor reflected this illumination, golden facets blending with the soft reds and blues from the stained glass above. He did not move, yet he was fully aware of every detail. The hum of life support systems, the faint vibration from distant energy conduits, the subtle motions of servitors performing silent ministrations. The Emperor's gaze never wavered, yet its focus was far-reaching. He did not speak, yet the weight of his will was comprehensible. It was a force that demanded obedience, inspired unity, and ensured that humanity's expansion remained inexorable. The Custodian considered eternity, not as a concept, but as burden and duty entwined. The Imperium would not falter under normal circumstance, yet perfection required vigilance. Even the smallest lapse could yield consequence, and even the brightest beacon could dim without care. His role was singular, to preserve the center, to ensure that the heart of the Imperium remained inviolate while the edges reached ever outward. Beyond Terra, new worlds awaited integration. Fleet movements were calculated to maintain balance across sectors already conquered. Supply and reinforcement networks stretched across unimaginable distances. Every operation, no matter how minor, contributed to the Imperium's coherence, and every coherence reinforced the Emperor's vision. And yet, in this age of triumph, the Custodian sensed subtle undercurrents, not of rebellion, but of possibility. Complexity, magnitude, and distance would always create gaps between intent and perception. His presence at the throne ensured that these gaps did not widen into peril. The Great Crusade continued, luminous and unyielding. The Imperium's dominion grew, not through chaos, but through deliberate action and unshakable purpose. At its center, the emperors will direct the flow of humanity's destiny, immutable and absolute, and before him, the Custodian remained, unwavering and eternal. He understood that victory was not measured in worlds gained or enemies vanquished. It was measured in the preservation of continuity, in the steady heartbeat of empire against the vastness of the galaxy. Even at the edge of perfection, the weight of eternity pressed gently yet insistently upon the heart of the Imperium, and the golden sentinel bore it silently, knowing that the foundation of all conquest was a stillness that endured at its center. As the Great Crusade pressed further into the galaxy, the Imperium's presence became both vast and intricate. Its boundaries extended across hundreds of systems, each with populations reshaped by contact, each with infrastructure slowly assimilated into the Empire's logic. The consolidation of victory had begun, not through force alone, but through a careful orchestration of governance, logistics, and observation. Every world added to the Imperium's dominion contributed not only wealth and manpower, but the subtle reinforcement of ideology, creating a lattice of human alignment that was as much psychological as material. Within the throne chamber of Terra, the Custodian stood as ever, the embodiment of unwavering vigilance. To him, the scale of expansion was measured not in light years or planetary systems, but in the currents of activity that pulsed through the Imperium's veins. Each report from a sector, each message delivered across the warp, each decision enacted by distant governors or Primarchs, became part of a symphony whose conductor was the Emperor himself. The Emperor did not need to command every movement. He commanded through presence. His will was radiance, touching fleets in transit, administrators in council, and legions Astartes in battle. Yet that radiance required guardianship, for even the strongest light cast shadow. The Custodian understood that the survival of this structure, delicate despite its immensity, rested upon constant vigilance at its source. Reports arriving from frontier sectors reflected both triumph and subtle friction. On newly contacted worlds, populations had grown compliant, yet old traditions lingered in quiet recesses. In some cases, compliance was pragmatic rather than heartfelt, expressed through efficient administration rather than reverent ceremony. In others, cultural assimilation introduced tensions that required patient management rather than coercion. Both scenarios were inevitable, and both were accounted for within the Emperor's calculations. Primarchs continued their campaigns across the stars, each asserting the character of his legion while adhering to the overarching strategy. Some were relentless in their speed, sweeping worlds into compliance before local rulers could resist. Others exercised caution, integrating populations through instruction and negotiation as much as by martial demonstration. The Custodian observed these interactions indirectly through reports, recognizing that the diversity of approach strengthened the Imperium's cohesion so long as all followed the central vision. Yet even in this era of apparent perfection, the Custodian perceived the delicate balance inherent in the Imperium's expansion. An empire so vast and multifaceted could not be maintained solely through success. Its endurance depended on the management of subtle currents. Warp storms might delay communication. Supply chains might falter across great distances. Local governors might interpret doctrine in ways unanticipated. Each of these contingencies demanded awareness. Each required action when necessary. The throne chamber itself seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. Light filtered through its high windows in shifting patterns, illuminating the Custodian's golden armor in muted reflection. Servitors moved in silent patterns, maintaining environmental equilibrium, their soft hums blending with the distant vibration of power conduits beneath Terra. Yet these mechanical activities did not disturb the stillness of the chamber. Rather, they reinforced it, an echo of the Emperor's own control presence. The Custodian's vigilance was both physical and metaphysical. He perceived not only what occurred within the chamber, but the currents radiating outward, the movement of fleets across the warp, the alignment of planetary administrators, the loyalty of Legiones Astartes engaged in distant campaigns. Each element, though seemingly separate, was bound to the center by the Emperor's will. Each might falter, and yet each could be corrected through the constant and unyielding attention that the Custodian provided. Terra itself had become a symbol, monumental and enduring. Hive cities pulsed with life, Manufactoria churned with endless production, and the Mechanicum refined its technologies in pursuit of efficiency and precision. The population regarded the Emperor not as a distant ruler, but as the axis of human destiny, a presence whose guidance, whether acknowledged consciously or unconsciously, shaped every aspect of their existence. Despite this apparent stability, the Custodian knew that vigilance must remain absolute. Magnitude invites challenge not only from external forces, but from internal divergence. Decisions made at great distances, however minor they seemed, could accumulate into unforeseen consequence. It was a responsibility of those at the center to ensure that alignment did not fracture. In this understanding, the Custodian found clarity. The Emperor's attention, while serene and motionless in appearance, extended across the Imperium in waves of focus that reached the farthest colonies. The Astronomican burned steadily, a psychic beacon that ensured navigators could traverse the warp with certainty. Its light was constant, yet its maintenance demanded the greatest concentration. For without it, the lattice of human expansion risked becoming directionless. Across distant sectors, fleets prepared for continued campaigns, but these were now as much about reinforcement and integration as they were about conquest. Governors' swords of loyalty, often ceremonially, and populations internalized the imperial truth through education and practical governance. The Imperium's expansion had created not merely territory, but cohesion, and the refinement of that cohesion was now as crucial as its initial formation. The Custodian contemplated the measure of his duty. He was not strategist, administrator, or emissary. He was sentinel, yet his proximity to the Emperor granted him awareness that surpassed mere observation. He perceived patterns of cause and consequence invisible to those engaged directly in the crusade. His presence ensured that the heart of the Imperium, its focus, its radiance, its continuity, would remain secure while the edges pressed outward. Even as victories accumulated and compliance spread, the Custodian understood that endurance required more than triumph. It required constancy, a steady presence capable of bridging the expanse of space and time. In this way, the Great Crusade, though radiant and unyielding, relied upon the stillness at its center as much as upon the momentum at its edges. As Terra rotated toward night, the throne chamber's illumination softened. Shadows stretched across the floor, the golden reflection of armor shimmering in subdued light. The Custodian adjusted his stance imperceptibly, guardian spear upright, ready. The Emperor's gaze remained fixed, distant, encompassing the Imperium with unbroken perception. And at that center, where the weight of expansion, consolidation, and expectation converged, the Custodian maintained his eternal vigil, understanding that the survival of an empire depended not only upon conquest achieved, but upon the vigilance sustained against the subtle drift of time and distance. The Imperium advanced, steady and luminous, but at its core remained a stillness as profound as a void beyond. It was here that the fate of countless stars rested, and here that one golden sentinel bore witness, unwavering and eternal. The Imperium had reached a scale that surpassed simple comprehension. Systems counted by the thousands fell under its domain, their populations molded into compliance and guided by the Emperor's vision. Trade, supply, and communication stretched across the galaxy in intricate networks, interlaced with fleets and legions of Astartes that ensured the extension of order beyond the boundaries of reason. Expansion had slowed in places, not for want of will, but because magnitude demanded stabilization. Each world added to the Imperium's reach required consolidation, observation, and the reinforcement of the structures that made unity possible. Within the heart of Terra, the Custodian stood as he always had, unbroken and unwavering. His golden armor reflected the subdued luminescence of the throne chamber, and his grip upon his guardian spear remained precise and still. He did not need to move. His vigilance did not rely on action but on constancy. Through him, the center of the Imperium remained protected. Through him, the Emperor's focus could extend unimpeded, unchallenged, and absolute. Reports from distant sectors arrived with predictable cadence, though their contents suggested subtle shifts. On certain worlds, the process of integration revealed variations in compliance, sometimes a lingering adherence to pre-existing traditions, sometimes deviations in the interpretation of doctrine. These were not failures, nor acts of defiance. They were consequences of scale, reminders that no empire, however ordered, could perfectly align the thoughts of billions across distances measured in light years. The Custodian noted each anomaly, recording them in his awareness, perceiving patterns that ordinary observers could not. He understood that the Imperium's cohesion relied upon the alignment of countless discrete actions, fleets moving in formation, governors executing instructions, legions of Astartes enforcing presence, populations absorbing instruction. Each element, however small, contributed to the overall stability, and when it faltered, the Custodian's presence ensured that correction would follow with immediacy. The Emperor did not intervene in every detail. His will radiated outward, shaping outcomes indirectly, allowing his Primarchs, his fleets, and his administrators to execute action with discretion tempered by loyalty. But the Custodian remained at the center, the fulcrum upon which the Imperium's equilibrium rested. The greater the reach of the crusade, the more essential that presence became. The Primarchs arrived periodically, each accompanied by reports of victories and challenges alike. Some brought news of rapid compliance, others of extended campaigns requiring patience and subtlety. A few discussed anomalies, regions where the warp resisted navigation, or populations where indoctrination was slow. The Emperor listened in composed silence, his responses deliberate and minimal, yet full of authority. The Custodian, ever watchful, discerned the undercurrent of strategy, the alignment of intent, and the patterns of execution that would ensure continued success. Beyond Terra, the galaxy remained vast and unyielding. Xeno's domains persisted at the borders of human expansion. Warp currents shifted unpredictably, occasionally complicating the translation of fleets or the arrival of astropathic messages. In some sectors, isolated conflict required localized intervention, minor in scope but significant for the populations affected. These were challenges the Imperium could meet, but they demanded attention nonetheless, for each disruption had the potential to propagate. The Custodian's awareness extended to these regions as much as to the throne chamber itself. He did not act in haste. He did not judge. He merely observed, ensuring that the center remained intact, that the Emperor's will flowed unbroken through every channel, and that the vastness of human dominion remained coherent. Terra itself continued in disciplined order. Hive cities expanded, manufactoria produced without pause, and mechanicum laboratories refined technologies with exacting precision. The imperial truth shaped education, culture, and ideology across billions of citizens. Art, ceremony, and architecture reflected the Emperor's presence, monumental, enduring, precise. Yet even in the civilization of certainty, the Custodian recognized the need for guardianship. Magnitude introduced vulnerability, and vigilance at the core prevented the subtle erosion of unity. The Emperor's gaze did not waver. His presence radiated not as spectacle, but as certainty. The Astronomican burned brightly, its psychic light sustaining navigation across the warp. Each pulse, each flicker of its signal, was anchored by him, and the Custodian, steadfast and motionless, ensured that no force, internal or external, could disrupt the focus that maintained the Imperium coherence. In this era, the Crusade had become as much about consolidation as conquest. Fleets secured sectors not merely by presence, but by reinforcing loyalty and implementing governance structures. Administrators codified policy, governors executed it. Legions Astartes ensured compliance when necessary. Each action, however routine, was essential. Each contribution supported the Imperium's ongoing unity. The Custodian contemplated the weight of such magnitude. An empire spanning thousands of worlds was not simply maintained through power or strategy, but through continuous alignment, through observation, through the preservation of coherence. Even minor divergence could grow unnoticed into disruption if the center's vigilance faltered. That was why his role, though singular and often invisible, was absolute. As Terra rotated through artificial night, the throne chamber was suffused in muted light. Shadows stretched across marble and gold. Servitors moved in silent rhythm, maintaining environmental equilibrium, their hum a low counterpoint to the quiet intensity that filled the chamber. The Emperor remained seated, his awareness extending beyond the palace, across the galaxy, through time and space. The Custodian's grip on his spear tightened imperceptibly, a signal not of readiness for immediate action, but a perpetual presence. Victory alone was not enough to preserve the Imperium. Continuity required attention, constancy, and it will unbroken by distance or scale. The Great Crusade advanced, luminous and precise, yet the Custodian understood that its ultimate preservation rested not solely upon fleets or Primarchs, not upon conquest or ceremony, but upon the vigilance sustained at the very center. The Imperium's structure, vast and intricate, could only endure if the stillness at its heart remained absolute. And so he stood, unwavering, golden against shadow, the measure of eternity itself, ensuring that the Imperium's radiance did not falter, that the Emperors would remain uninterrupted, and that humanity's expansion continued into the stars with certainty, guided by a presence as constant as the light of the Astronomican itself. By this stage of the Great Crusade, the Imperium's presence had become immense, stretching across hundreds of star systems, each interlinked through networks of governance, communication, and military oversight. Worlds that had once been isolated, scattered, or lost to time were now aligned under a singular authority. Populations, diverse in origin and culture, were guided toward common purpose, their individuality tempered by law, order, and the overarching influence of the Emperor's vision. Each addition to this vast structure contributed not only resources or manpower, but a subtle reinforcement of the Imperium's coherence, building a lattice that held across unimaginable distances. Within the throne chamber of Terra, the Custodian maintained his vigil, motionless yet acutely aware. Time seemed to move differently here, measured not in hours but in the rhythms of empire. The arrival of reports, the pulse of fleets through the warp, the subtle shifts in regional governance. Every movement, every message, every decision coalesced into a pattern, and at its center was the Emperor, whose will shaped the outcome of countless worlds even as he remained seated, unmoving, and absolute. The Astronomican continued its radiant guidance across the galaxy, its psychic beacon steady despite the strain of sustaining navigation for thousands of fleets. The Custodian perceived its subtle fluctuations, not as weakness but as a natural ebb and flow of immense power under relentless focus. The light of the Astronomican was both tool and symbol, a channel for mortal navigation and a manifestation of the Emperor's authority. Reports from frontier worlds indicated both progress and variance. Some populations had embraced the Emperor's directives with genuine conviction, aligning instinctively with the principles of the Imperium. Others complied pragmatically, their loyalty expressed through efficiency and adherence rather than fervent admiration. Occasionally, subtle inconsistencies appeared in cultural assimilation, minor divergences in interpretation of doctrine that required measured attention. The Custodian registered each nuance, understanding that even trivial deviations, if unchecked, could propagate across sectors. The Primarchs continued to shape the Crusade through their Legiones Astartes. Each campaign bore the character of a commander, swift, decisive actions by some, patient integration and instruction by others. Variations in style were deliberate, reflecting both temperament and circumstance, yet all were calibrated to serve the Emperor's greater design. The Custodian observed these strategies indirectly, perceiving their effects on the Imperium's balance and ensuring that the center remained steady regardless of the intensity or approach of distant campaigns. Terra itself remained a beacon of organization. Hive cities continued to expand under strict regulation. Manufactoria churned endlessly, producing the machinery, arms, and materials required to sustain the crusade. Educational systems instilled the principles of the imperial truth, reinforcing obedience and comprehension across billions of citizens. Statues, banners, and ceremonial displays reflected the emperor's presence, monumental yet devoid of overt divinity, though they inspired often approached reverence. Even in this structured society, the Custodian understood that vigilance was necessary. Magnitude introduced subtle vulnerability. The Imperium scale created points where minor errors could magnify if not contained. Warp disturbances, delayed communications, or misinterpretation of doctrine could ripple through multiple systems before correction. Though the Emperor's vision was vast, the center's stability depended upon guardianship. Within the throne chamber, light shifted across stained glass, casting muted colors upon marble floors and golden armor. Servitors performed their tasks in silence, maintaining equilibrium and precision. The Custodian's attention encompassed these movements, yet extended further, touching upon the flow of fleet movements, the status of governors, and the alignment of Legiones Astartes far beyond Terra. Each element, distant though it might be, converged upon the chamber's center, anchored by the Custodian's constant presence. The Emperor's gaze, serene and distant, extended beyond the material. It reached into the warp, into sectors beyond observation, into the currents that directed the flow of fleets and the outcomes of conflicts. Each decision, each adjustment, each subtle redirection of resources emanated from him with precision. The Custodian sensed the breadth of this control and the weight it carried. It was immense, encompassing the past, present, and anticipated future of the Imperium. As fleets prepared to secure additional systems, as governors maintained compliance and populations absorbed instruction, the pulse of dominion continued. Expansion and consolidation were no longer separate acts. They intertwined, forming a steady rhythm that reinforced unity while expanding reach. The Imperium was luminous, ordered, and relentless, yet it required constant monitoring to ensure that no element deviated from the intended harmony. The Custodian contemplated the paradox inherent in this scale. Triumphs were many, victories assured, yet the true measure of the Imperium's strength was not conquest but endurance. The maintenance of order across countless systems demanded precision, foresight, and unwavering presence. Victory could be fleeting if the foundation of alignment were to falter. Beyond the palace, distant worlds anticipated the next phase of campaigns, their populations secured but not yet fully integrated. Supply lines stretched taut, fleets repositioned, and Primarchs refined their strategies to maintain cohesion. Each sector's ability reinforced the Imperium's overall continuity, yet the potential for deviation persisted. The Custodian's duty ensured that the flow of will from Terra remained uninterrupted, a constant conduit sustaining the entire structure. The Emperor's stillness within the throne chamber masked the magnitude of his focus. His will, precise and immutable, held the Imperium together as fleets, governors, and Legiones Astartes executed their roles across space. The Custodian, unwavering and eternal, maintained the center's integrity. Victory, conformity, and unity emanated from that stillness, ensuring that humanity's expansion remained coherent and relentless. Even as the crusade pressed into unexplored sectors, even as the galaxy's expanse tested logistics, patience, and strategy, the Custodian recognized that the true measure of success lay not in the number of systems acquired, but in the constancy of alignment. The Imperium's brilliance depended on the unbroken pulse of its center, where the Emperor's vision and the sentinel's vigilance intertwined. And so, the Imperium continued to extend itself, radiant and ordered, its expansion guided by calculated precision and unwavering authority. At the heart of it all, the Custodian remained steadfast, a guardian of the pulse of dominion, ensuring that the radiance of humanity's triumph endured across the stars, unbroken and inviolate. In the latter decades of the Great Crusade, the Imperium's reach had become nearly incomprehensible. Worlds once isolated in ignorance now thrived under imperial governance, their populations guided by systems designed to ensure stability and alignment with the Emperor's vision. The conquest of new territories had slowed not from lack of will, but from the demands of magnitude. Each added system required consolidation, observation, and the careful integration of its people and resources into the lattice of human dominion. Expansion had become measured, deliberate, and precise, reflecting the maturity of an empire that had learned both triumph and patience. Within the throne chamber of Terra, the Custodian continued his eternal vigil, unyielding and unbroken. The chamber itself seemed almost removed from ordinary time, a nexus of stillness amid the vast momentum of the galaxy. Through him, the heartbeat of the Imperium could be sensed, the flow of fleet movements, the administration of countless sectors, and the subtle currents of compliance and ideology radiating outward from Terra Center. The Custodian understood that the Emperor's will alone could not sustain the vast structure. The coherence of the Imperium relied upon constant guardianship, upon the unwavering presence of those who could maintain focus where magnitude threatened distraction. The Astronomican blazed across the void, its psychic light a constant guide to human navigators. Every pulse of its signal reflected both purpose and effort, radiating certainty across warp-swept corridors. The Custodian perceived its subtle undulations and understood that each represented the Emperor's attention, the conscious act of sustaining navigation across a galaxy vast beyond measure. Without this presence, fleets would falter, and the Imperium's cohesion could waver. Reports from distant worlds revealed both progress and nuance. On many systems, populations had adopted imperial structures with minimal resistance, compliance expressed through efficiency and civic order rather than fervent zeal. On others, older customs lingered, requiring patient management to ensure alignment without coercion. Occasionally, anomalies arose, minor deviations in doctrine or unexpected responses to administration. Such variations, though insignificant alone, could propagate if left unchecked. The Custodian's awareness encompassed these subtleties, allowing him to perceive patterns invisible to ordinary observers and to ensure that the Imperium's center remained unbroken. The Primarchs continued their campaigns across the stars, each applying the character of his legion to the unique circumstances of conquest and integration. Some swept worlds swiftly into compliance, leaving decisive evidence of the Legiones Astartes' might. Others exercised caution, blending military precision with instruction and governance to secure loyalty over time. These diverse approaches were calibrated by the Emperor's overarching vision, and the Custodian discerned their effect upon the Imperium's equilibrium, ready to intervene indirectly through presence if dissonance arose. Terra itself remained a testament to order and discipline. Hive cities pulsed with life, manufactoria produced with unceasing exactitude, and mechanicum laboratories refined technology with ever-increasing precision. The imperial truth shaped education, ideology, and culture, instilling obedience and comprehension across billions of citizens. Monuments and ceremonial displays reflected the Emperor's influence, monumental and unyielding, yet restrained in their expression. Awe existed, but it was guided, not in tempered devotion. The line between reverence and ritual was maintained through structured clarity. Even amid stability, the Custodian understood that vigilance remained essential. The scale of the Imperium introduced subtle vulnerabilities. Misinterpretation of doctrine, delayed communication across light years, warp disturbances affecting fleet coordination. The margin for error, though narrow, was real. The Custodian's presence ensured that the stillness of the Imperium center preserved continuity, absorbing minor irregularities before they could disturb the whole. Light filtered through the chamber's high windows, casting shifting colors across the marble floor and the Custodian's golden armor. Servitors moved with silent precision, performing their ministrations without disturbing the ambient calm. The Custodian's focus extended beyond the chamber itself, reaching into the vast network of the Imperium. Fleet movements, governor compliance, and legion deployments across sectors both distant and marginal. Each element, while autonomous in appearance, ultimately converged upon the throne as the true center of human unity. The Emperor's gaze remained distant, his awareness encompassing not only the material galaxy but the currents of the warp itself. Each subtle decision, each calculated direction of effort, resonated across time and space, ensuring alignment and reinforcing cohesion. The Custodian perceived the scope and understood that magnitude, even when mastered, carried latent consequence. Victory alone did not sustain the Imperium. Stability required unbroken attention. Beyond the immediate reach of Terra, fleets repositioned to consolidate gains, secure supply lines, and reinforce sectors already integrated. Governors reaffirmed loyalty through ceremony and governance. Populations absorbed the patterns of compliance into their daily lives. Expansion and consolidation were no longer separate acts but intertwined, forming a rhythm that underpinned the Imperium's endurance. The Custodian contemplated the nature of this scale. Magnitude, though radiant and triumphant, introduced risk. Each victory contained potential vulnerability. The smallest lapse, unobserved, could propagate unpredictably across sectors. Vigilance at the center was therefore not symbolic, but essential. It ensured that the pulse of human dominion remained coherent, that the Emperor's vision retained clarity, and that the Imperium's radiance endured without interruption. As Terra rotated through artificial night, shadows deepened in the throne chamber, stretching across marble, gold, and polished armor. The Custodian adjusted his stance imperceptibly, his spear upright, an anchor against entropy. The Emperor remained seated, serene, and absolute, the axis around which human expansion revolved. The galaxy beyond continued to stretch outward, immense and uncharted, yet the stillness of the center ensured that expansion retained purpose and alignment. In this age of calm before the distant horizon, the Custodian understood that the Crusade's success was measured not in worlds conquered, but in coherence preserved, in the constancy of vigilance, and in the steady guidance of the Emperor's will. The Imperium advanced, luminous and unyielding, yet dependent upon the silent sentinel who bore the weight of eternity at its heart. By the closing years of the Great Crusade's first era, the Imperium had achieved a scale and cohesion that few could truly comprehend. Entire star systems, once isolated and disparate, now moved in unison under the Emperor's vision. Trade routes, supply lines, and fleet movements formed a lattice of interdependence, each node inextricably linked to the next. Populations, guided by the principles of the imperial truth, lived in disciplined conformity, their individual concerns absorbed into the broader purpose of human dominion. The empire had become not merely expansive, but interwoven, a complex organism sustained by order, foresight, and unwavering will. Within the throne chamber of Terra, the Custodian maintained his eternal vigil. Time here was measured not in hours or days, but in the pulses of the Imperium, the arrival of messages from distant governors, the subtle adjustments of fleets navigating warp routes, the measured progress of integration across newly aligned worlds. Each movement, though occurring far from Terra's orbit, converged upon the throne. Each was observed, recorded, and accounted for within the Custodian's awareness. His presence ensured that the center remained unbroken, that the Emperor's will radiated outward without distortion or hesitation. The Emperor himself appeared unmoving, seated upon the throne, yet the Custodian sensed the immensity of his focus. The Astronomican blazed steadily, a psychic beacon whose light reached across the galaxy, guiding navigators and fleets alike. Its brilliance was not effortless. It required constant attention and concentration of staggering intensity. Without it, even the most disciplined commanders could lose direction, and the vast lattice of the Imperium could falter. The Custodian understood that this light was more than navigation. It was the axis upon which the Crusade turned, the constant by which every sector aligned. Reports arrived with unbroken rhythm. Some spoke of swift compliance on newly discovered worlds, populations readily accepting imperial governance. Others detailed regions where assimilation required patience. Local customs persisted, minor inconsistencies in doctrine arose, and deviations in procedure appeared. Though inconsequential in isolation, the Custodian knew that even minor irregularities, if unchecked, could ripple across the Imperium's vast structure. His awareness registered each subtlety, ready to correct or observe as needed, ensuring continuity remained absolute. The Primarchs continued to lead their legions Astartes across the stars. Some were relentless, sweeping planets into compliance with decisive force. Others exercised caution, blending military precision with patient instruction and governance. Their campaigns were autonomous in execution, yet unified in purpose, all coordinated by the Emperor's overarching vision. The Custodian observed the interplay of autonomy and obedience, recognizing that even at the scale of hundreds of systems, coherence depended upon alignment with the center. Terra itself reflected the Imperium's maturity. Hive cities stretched skyward and downward, manufactoria produced ceaselessly, and mechanicum laboratories refined technology with precision and exactitude. Educational institutions instilled the principles of the imperial truth, reinforcing ideological and civic conformity across billions of citizens. Monumental architecture, ceremonial spaces, and statues commemorated the emperor's presence. Awe, restrained and deliberate, guided the populace's perception. The emperor was not merely ruler, but axis of humanity's destiny. Even in apparent stability, the Custodian recognized that vigilance remained essential. The Imperium scale introduced subtle vulnerabilities. Warp currents could delay fleet coordination, misinterpretation of doctrine could arise across light years, and minor disturbances in isolated sectors could propagate unexpectedly. These contingencies required awareness of the center, for coherence was sustained not solely through conquest, but through constancy and foresight. The Custodian's presence ensured that the Emperor's radiance remained uninterrupted, that the lattice of human dominion held firm across distances and time. The chamber's light shifted with Terra's rotation, casting elongated shadows across polished marble and golden armor. Servitors moved in silent, exact patterns, maintaining environmental equilibrium. The Custodian's focus extended beyond these motions, encompassing the broader Imperium. Fleets in transit, governors maintaining order, legions Astartes engaged in distant campaigns. Each distant element ultimately converged upon the throne, anchored by the sentinel's constant awareness. The Emperor's gaze, serene and implacable, extended into the warp, into currents that guided fleet movement and anticipated potential disturbances. Decisions, whether manifest in victory or administrative adjustment, emanated from him with absolute precision. The Custodian understood the weight of this control, the responsibility inherent in sustaining both expansion and coherence simultaneously. The greatest achievements of the Crusade were not merely in the number of worlds acquired, but in the uninterrupted alignment of countless systems and populations. Outside Terra's orbit, fleets maneuvered to consolidate gains and reinforce sectors. Governors reaffirmed loyalty through ceremony and governance. Populations absorbed compliance into the rhythms of daily life. Expansion had become measured, integrated, and continuous, each act strengthening the Imperium's structural integrity. Yet within this expansion lay a subtle truth. Coherence depended upon constancy at the center, upon the stillness that ensured alignment across magnitude and distance. The Custodian contemplated this paradox. The Imperium's triumph was evident in victories and assimilation, yet its endurance depended upon the uninterrupted pulse of its center. Every decision, every act of observation, every subtle redirection of influence sustained the balance that allowed the Empire to endure. Without such constancy, even radiant conquest could fade. As Terra rotated into night, shadows deepened across the chamber. The Custodian adjusted imperceptibly, his golden spear upright, a silent anchor against time's drift. The Emperor remained seated, unbroken, the axis of humanity's expansion. The Imperium advanced, vast and luminous, yet it relied upon the vigilance maintained at the heart. Victory alone was insufficient. Continuity required the eternal presence of those who could preserve alignment, who could bridge distance, magnitude, and complexity with unwavering constancy. In the stillness of the throne chamber, where shadow met light and silence carried the weight of a galaxy, the Custodian maintained his eternal vigil. He understood that the Imperium's survival depended not only upon conquest achieved, but upon the unbroken, radiant focus sustained at its heart. Expansion, order, and unity flowed outward, but their origin, absolute and unyielding, remained here, in the stillness, in the presence of the Emperor, and in the sentinel who stood alone to safeguard it.